You're just a cheap, cheap champagne, baby. Looking okay at the outside, but feeling like a headache again. Ooh, like a cheap, cheap champagne. That's what you are. You like a cheap, cheap, cheap champagne. Draining me, giving me heartaches, headaches, all together. Yeah. You're like a cheap, cheap, cheap champagne. Cheap champagne. Cheap champagne. Looking okay at the outside, but you're giving me a headache, baby. Headache, baby. Oh. You like to toss and turn. You like to fight and burn all over the place. It's such a disgrace. You're like a cheap, cheap, cheap champagne. Cheap champagne. Cheap champagne. Trying to look like a VIP. But you still are a cheap, cheap, cheap champagne. You're like a cheap, ooh, cheap champagne. Draining me oh, so bad. Ooh, I cannot think clear. I cannot act right when I get the poison, baby. Hot tonight. You're like a cheap, cheap, cheap champagne. Cheap champagne, cheap champagne. What is wrong with you? Are you so hurt inside? You like to hurt everybody too? Or is it just your foolish pride? Foolish pride. You're like a cheap, cheap, cheap champagne. Cheap champagne. Cheap champagne. You're like a cheap, cheap, cheap champagne. You look good at the outside, but all you do is giving pain. Giving pain and heartache and headache all together. Draining my energy. You're no good for me. You're no good for me. No good, no good for me, baby. Now I finally see you're too cheap for me, yeah. How cheap, cheap, cheap. You're too cheap. Cheap champagne. You're like a cheap champagne. You're like a cheap, cheap, cheap champagne. Looking okay at the outside, but all you do is drain. Oh, baby, you think you're everything, but you're nothing. And I am worth too much more than your poison. Your cheap champagne, your poison, messing with my brain, make me go insane. You are so draining. You're like a cheap, cheap, cheap champagne. Cheap champagne. Cheap champagne. You're like a cheap, cheap, cheap champagne. Looking okay at the outside, but all you do is giving pain. Ooh, ooh, ooh. I'm better moving on now, baby. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Let the bygones be bygones right now. Now I see you're too cheap for me. Too cheap for me. You're like a cheap, cheap, cheap champagne. Looking okay at the outside, but all you do is giving pain. You're like a cheap, cheap, cheap champagne. Cheap champagne. Cheap champagne. Da 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 da. da 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 da. You're just a cheap champagne. Cheap champagne. All you do is mess with my brain. You're just a cheap, cheap. You're too cheap for me. You're just a cheap, cheap, cheap. You're so cheap. You're just a cheap. Oh, like a cheap.